Think we got the recording going in?
Yes, sir.
All right.
All yours.
Thanks, Corey.
All right. Thank you, Corey. My name is Dave Munzenmeyer. I'm the Rule Project Manager for this Rule project. And we'll have some points of contact and contact information as we get into the presentation. I am the best single point of contact if you want to reach somebody and ask a question, get some additional input, or need some feedback. I'm not the technical expert on all things, so it may be a case of, I got your message, I'm going to get an answer for you, and I'll get back to you. But I am the best single point of contact as we go through this rulemaking process. Just to talk a little bit about what we're doing here, we're gonna discuss the rulemaking process, how it works. This current rulemaking that we're doing right now is to implement the emission guidelines for existing oil and gas facilities. We're going to talk a little bit about what the rules do in our technical presentation, and then we're going to accept stakeholder input and have a Q&A. And as Corey said in the introduction, and you'll hear it said more than once as we go forward, this is not a formal process like comment post-proposal prior to adopting a rule. This is an informal process where we will take input and we will use it as we go forward in the rulemaking, but there's not a one-for-one return on your investment in the comment, as it were. There will be a comment and a response like there is in a formal process. So the rulemaking process, this particular piece involves what we call stakeholder outreach. That's what we're doing right now, meaningful engagement. We're getting information from invested stakeholders as to how we can make this rule work best from different points of view. After we get the stakeholder outreach, we put together a rule proposal package. That rule proposal package will go through a formal comment process and we'll go through a public hearing. Following that, we will go through a formal adoption process. So those steps are like any other rule proposal. We've just added on the stakeholder process at the beginning to get some input because of the nature of this rule. So what we are doing is we're looking at adding a new Division 7 to Chapter 113, Subchapter D, to implement the emissions guidelines. EPA has published 40 CFR Part 60, Subpart OOOOc. Might say Quad OC, it's a little bit easier, Subpart OOOOc. And with this, we are also submitting a state plan to ensure the state of Texas maintains the authority to regulate existing crude oil and natural gas facilities. We're publishing the emission guidelines, we're creating a rule, and then we're maintaining state authority through the introduction of a state plan. We have a couple of contacts, and I believe the information is available on the web, so I'm not going to read through these. But we do type out the links. That's why it's kind of a long link if you have access actually tapping on a link in the presentation. In the Quad OC webpage, you'll find the background documents, rule preparation documents, everything that's available to the public, also instructions on how to provide input. And then once we get a proposal and we publish a formal proposal and we get ready for adoption and we publish the formal adoption. So again, after we have our technical presentation, which we're going to discuss the components of the rule and what we're looking at and what kind of input we're looking for, we'll have a live input and question and answer session where we'll take question and answers here in the room as well as online for those who have registered to participate in the question and answer session. This slide will come up a couple of times and you'll see it again, and it'll be available in the document package. Written comments are going to be accepted through December 31st. And again, this is different from our normal process where we accept comments for 30 days and then go forward. We're actually extending, because we're going through 3 stakeholder meetings, we're extending the comment period until December 31st when we're accepting comments in writing to Gwen Rico at that address, by our fax address, or online through the comment portal. And I would note that if you make comments and you're submitting them, please refer to the project number, which is 2024-027-113AI. Here's my contact information. And again, we're going to have this material available online so people can get it. It's real easy, david.munzenmeyer@tceq.com. All right, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dan, who will go through the technical part of the presentation. Except I didn't do it in the right order. that the right one? Yes.
Yes.
It's the right one. And we go to present. Let's see if it's coming up. Gonna have to speak louder. Okay. So got a little bit more information to add, and I was told first off that I need to speak up. So when we're using the microphone, sorry if you couldn't hear me. Want to remind you, and I want to repeat again, that we are accepting written e-fax or comments through the comment portal through December 31st of this year. All the way through the end of the year, we're accepting input, comments, questions. And I've also been asked to mention that the webinar has a 1,000 person capacity limit. Not sure if we've hit or exceeded that capacity, but I was asked to let people know. So there may be some issues with access once you get to that 1,000 person limit. All right, and with that, I'll turn it over to Dan. Dan.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So I'm going to go over some of the technical aspects of the new rule for existing sources in the oil and gas industry. And toward the end, I'll turn it back over to David to go over a few more details on the state plan requirements. Once again, my name is Dan Sims. I'm with the Air Permits Division, Technical Specialist. So we're just going to go over these bullet points you see here, just a little general information on the new rule for oil and gas sources. We will look at some of the applicability and standards for the particular facility types associated with these oil and gas operations. Look at a little bit on regulatory impacts that may result from this rulemaking. And then I'm going to turn it back over to David to go over a few more details on the state plan requirements. And then we'll finish up with the Q&A session where we get your feedback. All right, starting with general information. The intention of this rule is to reduce methane emissions from existing and unmodified sources in the oil and natural gas industry. What you see here are the sectors of this industry that are covered and those that are not covered. The covered sources include the production portion, which would be fluids, either liquid or gases, coming from wells that may be on-site or off-site at a facility, as well as processing of these fluids. And specific to gas handling, there's natural gas transmission as well as storage. What the rule does not cover is distribution, which is the point at which the gas as a product is distributed out to inline customers. Those operations are not covered. And additionally, for liquid handling, the petroleum refining processes are not covered by this rule. These are covered by different EPA standards. So here you see a rule summary of the new rules that were made effective earlier this year. We won't go into much detail on that first one. It is a new source performance standard for new and modified sources, and it addresses both methane and VOC. This was proposed and became effective in tandem with the emission guidelines that we're speaking on today in subpart Quado C of 40 CFR Part 60. And it is exclusive to methane emissions and existing unmodified sources. Existing sources that are modified would become subject to that new source performance standard. So we want you to be aware of it if any modifications occur. And the Federal Clean Air Act citations are included in this slide for reference. A little bit more information about rule development going forward. The final rules became effective 60 days after the Federal Register publication, which was back on March the 8th of this year. So the effective date is May 7th of 2024. We as a state agency have a 24-month window to develop our state plan. to submit to EPA. And upon approval of the state plan, there's an additional time period for sites to come into compliance. That deadline must be no more than 36 months from the submittal to EPA for approval. So we're looking at approximately a 5-year window at most for these existing sources to come into compliance. All right, let's move along to applicability and standards for the particular facility types. First, we'll take a quick look at the applicability dates for what is called the Quado series. There's 2 existing subparts for new and modified sources dating back to an effective date of 2011. 2011 to 2015 are subject to the original NSPS for oil and gas. 2015 to 22 is the Quado A subpart, and Quado B came along and established an effective date of December 2022, and any sources in existence prior to December 2022 will be subject eventually to the standards that are approved or incorporated through the state plan. So we'll look a little bit closer at those sectors that we were mentioning earlier. For production and processing, as I said previously, this would be your well sites located on where wells are located on shore. This can include storage tank batteries that may or may not have on-site wells. Storage tank batteries may receive from off-site wells and be subject to the rule. And gas handling includes the gathering and boosting compressor stations and any natural gas processing that's prior to distribution. Natural gas transmission and storage can include compressor stations and also include storage tank batteries for that associated liquid. Okay, we're going to go through the particular facility types that can be subject to the rule. One of them that is new to the Quado series is gas well liquids unloading. This is unloading of accumulated liquids from the well operation that may be hindering gas production. And the standard for this operation is to just use best management practices in accordance with the rule so that you can minimize or even eliminate the emissions from the unloading events that are sent to atmosphere. Any emissions that do go to atmosphere must be reduced by 95% for methane emissions using an appropriate closed vent system and control device as determined by the rule applicability. Another new source category is associated gas wells. This would be predominantly liquid producing wells that have obviously associated gas that needs to be handled as part of that liquid producing operation. For the Quado C emission guidelines, there is a threshold of methane emissions that would determine your requirements. If a existing well has greater than 40 tons per year of methane emissions from associated gas, those emissions must be either routed to a sales line or they must be used on site for some useful purpose. One main example is fuel for combustion devices that may be used on site, or this gas can be re-injected into the well, typically for the purpose of enhanced recovery. If all these options are technically infeasible, then the emissions must be routed to a control for 95% reduction. And this technical infeasibility must be documented annually. So each year, if the conditions that cause technical infeasibility to persist, if they continue to persist, you must document this annually. These requirements are essentially the same if you're less than or equal to 40 tons per year of methane. The one difference is that the technical infeasibility demonstration is not required if you're subject to option 4 above. All right, let's move on to compressors. This includes any wet seal or dry seal centrifugal compressors as well as reciprocating compressors. These facilities are not subject to a methane standard directly as far as a limit on the amount of emissions. They're more subject to a operational standard. It's based on a maximum volumetric flow rate, depending on the type of compressor you have. So wet seal centrifugal is limited to 3 standard cubic feet per minute per seal, while dry seal centrifugal is limited to 10 SCFM per seal, with reciprocating compressors having the lowest limit at 2 SCFM. There's also the option to route the emissions from a reciprocating compressor to a process via a closed vent system. And in addition, you must replace rod packing and conduct repairs and maintenance. This is a pretty standard requirement currently for reciprocating compressors. All right, we move on to process controllers and pumps. This was originally pneumatic controllers and pumps. These units have essentially a zero emission standard, and it was pointed out to me earlier that this standard is for use of natural gas. So if you're using natural gas to drive the device, then you're subject to these requirements. You do have the option to use a different fuel to comply with the rule. But if the controller is natural gas driven, it must either be self-contained or it must be routed to a process via closed vent system. There are some allowances for phase-in requirements associated with new and modified controllers, but for existing controllers, those don't apply. So there may be a reference to that in the notes for this slide, but that only applies to new and modified sources. Existing sources are subject to these standards if natural gas is used. Moving on to pumps, same zero emissions standard. And once again, this is over the next 4.5+ years. You must be coming into compliance with this zero emission standard. And this applies only if the site has electrical grid access and contains at least 3 diaphragm pumps. If either of those conditions are not met, you have the option to route the emissions to a process through vapor recovery or to a control device that reduces emissions by 95%. Okay, let's look a little bit at storage tanks. The Quado C storage tank definition is essentially accounted for within the tank battery definition. So what this newer version of the rule has done is established a tank battery as the affected facility. So it doesn't apply to storage tanks, it applies to a tank battery. And a tank battery may consist of a single storage tank, but what it essentially is a group of tanks that are manifolded for liquid transfer. So note that this is not connected to vapor space connection. It is liquid transfer. We shared liquid line, but the rule says manifolded together for liquid transfer. So 4 tanks that share a liquid line would be considered a tank battery. 4 tanks that do not share a liquid line would be considered 4 tank batteries, whether the vapor goes to the same place or not. Included the modification definition here because the Quado B rule includes some additional modification parameters that are not covered in the general NSPS. So you would need to be aware that if you add a storage vessel, you have modified your tank battery. And if you receive additional throughput from production or additional fluids at a compressor station or gas plant, you have also modified your storage tank, and you would need to look at those requirements for modified sources. The rule does specify the procedures for determining your potential to emit, for making your applicability determination as to whether your tank battery is affected. And it does also allow for emissions that are routed to a vapor recovery unit to be excluded from that affected facility determination. But the VRU itself must also meet some requirements that are described in the rule. So it can't just be any particular VRU. It must meet some closed vent system and cover requirements that are included in the rule. So if the As of now, these would be considered designated facilities, but through the state plan implementation, they would become affected facilities, and those facilities that trigger affected facility status must reduce emissions by 95%. And the threshold for affected facility status is a methane emission rate of 20 tons per year. If you were to exceed that emission rate, you would need to meet that 95% reduction standard for at least a 12-month period. There is an option for after a 12-month period, you're allowed to remove the whatever reduction method you're using if you maintain emissions below 14 tons per year for a consecutive 12-month period. So that can be at any point after you've triggered affected facility status. There are some requirements that can be relied upon in lieu of the emission guidelines. The major one would be NSPS KB for petroleum liquid storage. And this can be relied upon in place of those emissions if there is a floating roof tank installed on the roof, on the tanks, a floating roof installed on the tank, excuse me, and that no flash losses are occurring at those tanks. So the flash losses would have to have happened at some other upstream part of the process, even whether on or off-site. So if both of those conditions are met, the control requirements in NSPS KB can be relied upon. The rule specifies NSPS KB. That NSPS series has also been updated recently to add a new subpart, but that subpart is not referenced in the methane rule. So you would refer to the NSPS KB requirements. There are some additional federal rules listed in the emission guidelines that you can rely upon in place of Quad O-C requirements. Okay, let's move on to fugitive components. What you see here is a table showing the covered source and the particular monitoring program and frequency of monitoring associated with it. That first row is your single wellhead only sites and small well sites. This would be sites that don't have any other major equipment besides the well and whatever configuration you're using to handle the fluids that are produced from the well. This would be a single wellhead only site, obviously one well. And small well sites are those that only have one other piece of major equipment, such as a storage tank or anything that would be considered an affected facility besides fugitives. This is subject to a audio visual olfactory inspection or AVO, and this must be conducted once per quarter. I believe the rule defines a quarter as no closer together than 60 days or no farther apart than 4 months. There may be something in the background document to that effect, but there is some information on that as well. Moving on to multi-wellhead sites, this would be no major equipment, but there are 2 or more wellheads on site. It's subject to the same AVO inspection, but it's also subject to an additional monitoring on a semi-annual basis using optical gas imaging or OGI, or an alternative would be to use the existing EPA test method 21. Moving on to well sites with major equipment, this would be 2 or more pieces of equipment in addition to the wells, or any centralized production facilities, which would be those typically tank batteries that receive well fluids from offsite. These are subject to the same 2 monitoring techniques, just the higher frequency. The AVO inspections are bi-monthly. The OGI or method 21 alternative is quarterly. And then finally, compressor stations, subject to the same requirements, just on a slightly more frequent basis for AVO inspections. These would need to be conducted monthly instead of bi-monthly. Now, we mentioned 4 different sectors earlier: production, processing, and compressor stations, central production facilities. What we did not include on the previous table was the piping component emissions from natural gas processing plants. This source category, this facility category has been labeled as process units within the rule. So any requirements that are labeled as process units, this would essentially be the fugitive components at a natural gas processing plant. These are directly subject to OGI monitoring requirements on a bi-monthly basis, and they must adhere to protocols established in Appendix K of Subpart 60. This new Appendix K was proposed in conjunction with these methane rules and include additional requirements and steps that must be taken for OGI monitoring. I think we'll get into that a little bit on the next slide. What you see here is a few exceptions for existing gas processing plants for these monitoring requirements. Can be based on non-fractionating plants with a capacity below 10 MMSCF, million standard cubic feet per day, any components in vacuum service that are not connectors, and equipment used less than 300 hours per year and only emit during startup, shutdowns, upset events, or during use as a backup equipment, not as primary equipment. Okay, I mentioned a second ago about Appendix K. This applies currently to natural gas processing plants. EPA has indicated that there may be rulemaking for other source types, but for now it's just natural gas processing plants. And there's established protocol through this appendix for camera specifications for conducting the OGI surveys, verification of performance, the procedures for conducting the monitoring. There's also requirements for how operators should be trained, what qualifies someone as a trainer, and so on. All right, we're gonna move into regulatory impacts, just a couple here. The EPA has updated reporting requirements for all of these facility types in addition to well closure activities. This is done through EPA's website, Compliance and Emissions Data Reporting Interface, or CEDRI. And these reports are updated as of July 2nd. I think they had some issues with the website earlier in the summer, but our understanding is that these issues have been addressed. And there are also well flowback notifications that do come to TCQ, but again, this would only affect modified sources. So this would be a well that is fractured or refractured, and you would essentially trigger the new source performance standard at that point. Now, marginal or low producing wells do still have LDAR requirements that apply. And in order to meet the rule, you have the option to do a well closure in which you plug an existing well that may be abandoned or low producing. There are requirements for submitting a well closure plan. And in addition, there are LDAR requirements that you must conduct throughout the well closure process, up to and including a final survey through OGI that must be taken to confirm that the well is closed. And if there are any results from that survey that indicate that there are still emissions occurring, the rule does describe the corrective actions that must be taken. I think we've gotten back to David. He's going to talk a little bit more about the state plan requirements he mentioned earlier.
All right, thanks, Dan. As we said, this is a sort of a two-phase process. We're drafting rule language, and then we're ensuring that the rule language is enforceable through the state plan. Am I not talking loud enough? I'm getting a high sign. Can you hear me? Am I good now? Okay. Sorry, I don't want to blow out the speaker. Anyway, so when these rules happen, states must develop and submit a state plan that is as stringent to those requirements that exist in the emission guidelines in Quad OC. Standards performance must apply at all times, must identify an enforceable state mechanism for implementing the emissions guidelines, And want to make a note that EPA did acknowledge in the rule preamble that the Texas Administrative Code does not currently have a framework to regulate methane from minor sources. That's a gap. They're aware of it, and they're aware that that's part of our process. Additionally, there may be less stringent requirements when considering remaining useful life and other factors. And that's one of the areas that we're asking for input. Now, the state plan requirements are based on subpart BA, and they must be followed when developing a state plan. They're for the rulemaking agency. The state plan requirements in BA are for us, for TCEQ, but we want you to be aware that they're out there. The requirements include compliance schedules, certification of required hearing on the state plan, state progress reports, performance testing, monitoring, record-keeping, reporting requirements, and then documentation on meaningful engagement. How did we engage the stakeholders? How did we engage the potentially affected communities? Talk a little bit about remaining useful life and other factors. The state plan may apply less stringent standard to existing sources with an appropriate demonstration in accordance with 40 CFR 60 subpart BA. Requires a demonstration that facilities cannot reasonably achieve the degree of emissions limitation determined by the EPA, and may allow a longer compliance timeline. So there's two pieces. It can be less stringent if appropriate, and you can have a longer timeline to come into compliance. Those are based on, again, the remaining useful life and other factors. As we go through this, as part of the meaningful engagement, we're conducting stakeholder meetings. This is the first of the 3 stakeholder meetings, today, November 6th. We have an additional meeting November 14th in the evening in Arlington. That is an in-person only meeting. And one more meeting November 20th in Midland, which is in the evening and is also an in-person only meeting. Once again, I want to remind everybody that we will be accepting comments through our comment portal, directly in writing, and also via the fax portal through December 31st of this year. We have a long window for input through December 31st. And I would remind you, please include a reference to the rule project number 2024-027-113-AI, 2024-027-113-AI. Couple of links to web pages. We have the rule project webpage. We referenced that in the first presentation. And then also we have the public comments system link. So the 3 ways you can submit comments: directly in writing, through the eFax, or through the TCEQ comments web portal.